talk to everybody about this topic. I thought, wow, that's going to be kind of interesting because I know really what everybody's trying to do more or less. In the sense that you're either trying to look for a postdoc maybe after this, if you're a graduate student, or if you're a postdoc, you're going to be looking for a faculty position. And in this market, it's really competitive out there. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Apparently, you're supposed to sign in. And so, anyhow, you control the internet just as well as I can, really. And so I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you the great sites to go to, because the reality is there's more than one great site, and there's a lot of different thoughts that are out there. But what I did do was kind of distill it down to, I got 19 slides here. There's a lot of verbiage on it. I'm not going to read it to you. You guys can read. But I'm just going to try to tell you the important points that I see, not only when I look at a student that's finishing up to hire them as a postdoc, but more importantly when I've sat on chairs or search committees that look for either faculty members or even departmental chairs, because I've been on a couple of those here for this institution. And what do you look for? And at each level of your career, you're being evaluated on different things, right? And it's appropriate, right? People are not going to expect you to have 40 or 50 publications when you're coming out of your postdoc, right? That's very unrealistic. But if you're trying to advance to a tenure track faculty member, then maybe that is realistic, right? And so the concepts here are really important. So this is an overview of what I'm going to talk about, and I kind of did the who, what, where, when, why, and how of a research plan, simply because it's funny, when you have kids, I've kind of reverted back to elementary and middle school ways of doing things because it's the simplest way to communicate principles that are really key. And so really the first question is, you know, who needs a research plan? Well, we all do. And who really cares? And we'll see why that's important. What is a research statement and or a research plan? And what does it do? And we'll see why that's important in a moment. Where does a research statement belong? When do you give it? Things of that nature. When do I submit it? When is it important and useful? And then why? Why do you really need to give this information to your prospective employers in the first place? And then, more importantly, I think the question that everybody wants to know is, how do I put it together, really? Because that's the thing that everyone wants to figure out. What's the secret trick? So before I get into all those details, what I wanted to give you an example, and actually this comes from the Penn State website, their career website. When I was at UAB as a postdoctoral fellow, we started the Post-Doctoral Association there at UAB about 12 or 13 years ago, and Penn State essentially did the same thing. And it's really great because a lot of this is modeled after AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, which has this postdoctoral network that they've established for many years. And it's got a good set of guidance articles and web pages that kind of give you insight as to what to do. And I just use Penn State because they've got a career development office that's dedicated. For you guys, this institution, we don't have one, but that's not a bad thing, in the sense that really our institution is pretty small in comparison to other institutions where at least you guys were able to come together at this one meeting and probably talk easier amongst one another than some of the postdocs at bigger institutions because it's so darn big. But this research statement for a postdoc advertisement says a brief description of research, right? So when you're at this phase of the game, you probably just only done the research that was in your graduate career, and you probably might not have done any research to speak of in your undergrad career. Maybe you did. But it's not going to be a tremendous amount of information that you're going to have to communicate to the prospective employer. What about when you move up to an assistant professor? This is a first example of it. Well, they talk about all the things that you should send, and one is a statement of a research plan, okay? And so you'll see, we'll talk about what a research plan, a research statement is, and what that really means in a moment. And then this is another example where you have a statement of research interest and plans, right? So it's a little bit more, right? And that's because certain committees are really trying to get at different aspects of where you're coming from. But more importantly, as we go through the research statement, hopefully you'll see that you'll already have included all of that information that's germane to their decision-making process from the beginning, okay? But that's not to say that you don't read what they're asking very carefully. If you're going to, let's say, a tenure track associate or full professor, it changes. And here's an example of how it changes. You can see here a clear statement of their teaching and research interests. Because what ends up happening as you advance in your career, you may start off with 1, maybe 2 projects as a backup, but hopefully as you season, your focus and your expertise becomes more narrow and in depth, and you become a real expert in a particular area nationally and internationally. And so then it becomes really important to communicate a broader and larger depth of information of what it is you've done research-wise and where you're going to take your research program. In addition to that, the teaching requirements are also somewhat important. This depends upon whether you're applying, for example, to an institution that's primarily an undergrad institution and has a lot of teaching and they want you to actually educate their students on how to do research, or whether you're at a big university, let's say LSU in Baton Rouge, for example, even if you're in the undergrad campus where research is very prominent, there's still a lot of teaching there, right? And so they'll want to see how you integrate your research with teaching initiatives, teaching plans. So, statement, summary, proposal, what does that mean? What's the difference here? The 3 terms you'll see are used often interchangeably, but more importantly, the statement and summary usage are very similar, and that they really focus on your current research, okay? And depending on the position, you may want to say more about what you've done in the research statement or a summary than in the research proposal. Does that make sense? Does that everyone understand the difference between the statement versus the proposal? Because oftentimes what will happen if they've gone through the process of looking at all this material, and do keep in mind, when they send out an advertisement for a position, they have a particular kind of candidate in mind, right? Because they're looking for somebody to complement, let's say, an area of expertise that they don't have in their group. Here's some extra chairs up here. That's right, have a seat. And here, Shannon, you want to give it to back there? Hey, what's going on? And right here, make you sit in the front. No, he's not gonna. All right. And if that's the case and your application makes it through the first cut, sometimes they'll ask you to submit a research proposal. And what a proposal is essentially a version of your grant that you would submit, right? Because then they will want to evaluate your writing skills and your thought process and your logical process skills. One of the things that I'll reiterate it again and again in this presentation, and I'm no expert, and I don't know of anyone that really truly is over their whole career, but the one thing that I would highly encourage you to do is to continue to write. Because I sucked at it when I started. I'm still not much better than what I was then, I think. But the reality is, I get better the more I do it. And it gets easier, and it gets quicker, it gets less painful. And then more importantly, the more you do it, then it helps you because you begin to see, wow, A, I know a heck of a lot in this field, which is good. B, I can kind of synthesize my logic process on paper, which is key. Because you're not always going to have the opportunity to articulate that to people. The easiest and most common thing they're going to see from you are your writings, 9 times out of 10. I mean, they'll catch your presentations at a meeting, or they'll see it in a departmental seminar or whatever, but that's usually a snapshot in time, right? So, that's the difference between the summary statement and versus the proposal. And just talk a little bit more about the research proposal for candidates who are more senior. This proposal becomes really important. And if you remember that advert that talked about the research plan, proposal, and teaching concept, this really gives people an idea of where you're going. Not only just where you've come from, but where you're going. And it can include many things like an abstract, justification, observation. So in other words, a grant, right? So it may not be a full-blown grant, but it can look like one, essentially. So let's get into the details. Let's talk about the who of your research statement. So who needs a research statement? We all do. And believe it or not, even people who are in science fields that we aren't particularly active in, say engineering or computer programming, things of that nature, they also need research statements. Everyone who engages in any kind of scientific endeavor is invariably doing some form of research. And so a research plan is key there. Who cares about it? Well, as you have heard me say already, the search committee may just be the immediate boss or immediate person. Sorry, you get the unlucky seat. Everyone avoided it but you. I can't. Actually, you got a prize. No, I don't have a prize today. But so it may not just be one person, or excuse me, a committee. It may just be one person that sees it. And they care greatly about your research statement because this is your first introduction to them. Do not ever, 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 ever underestimate the power of the first impression. That's not to say that if you make a bad one, you can't recuperate. You can, but usually, if you make a solid first impression, that goes a long way, okay? And that's really important. Who reads your research statement? Well, of course, the search committee is the immediate boss, but believe it or not, other people may too, right? Other colleagues may say, well, you know, I was looking to hire this person because they have some bioinformatics, or they have some microbiome expertise, and you know, I did a little microbiology back in the day, but I really want to convert my research project and programs to microbiology, and I want to bring somebody in who has that expertise where they can learn from us and we can learn from them. Because believe it or not, any good mentor equally learns from you guys as you learn from us, really, in all actuality. Because if you don't, then at the end of the day, you're essentially just doing a set of commands and you're not really breaking down new barriers and moving things forward. So you may have your research statement given to other faculty members who may have expertise. They may say, hey Joe, does this sound right? I mean, I don't know much about this, but it sounds a little crazy. Or what do you think? Maybe administrative people that actually take a look at it. Again, this is a really good opportunity to make as strong first impression as you can. The what about your research statement. So what does a good research statement do? What does it accomplish? Well, it provides concise information and history of your research activity, past, present, and sometimes future, okay? Depending upon the level of, like I've just said, the level of position you're applying for, it may or may not include future. But you can include future in saying, hey, here's why I'm interested in your laboratory, because I've done A, B, C in the past, and I really think D is going to round out my skill set, right? It communicates your area of interest along with the nature of your work, as well as the importance or impact of your work in relation to the field you work in. So most people don't understand this sometimes. Sometimes these 2 points get a little lost. And the reason why I say that is because, you know what? Let's say, for example, you finish your graduate career and you had a single paper. And that paper was a culmination of 3.5, 4 years of work in an area that was just an egregious pain in the rear end, but you accomplished something significant. And it made an impact in the field. And that person that's looking at your application may just see that one paper and go, well, this person's got one paper and this person over here's got 5, but they may not appreciate the differences, right? And that's a very important thing because this is your opportunity to shine. You're telling people why the work that you've done is impactful or meaningful, things of that nature. And oftentimes that helps give the person who's reviewing these applications a chance to learn a little bit more about yourself, believe it or not. Because, you know, someone who's got the stick-to-itiveness and the grit to pound through a real hard thing and come out the other side with a really good paper that changes the field, man, that's pretty impressive. Those kind of folks you really do want to bring to your team. The other thing is, this is also an opportunity to communicate confidence and purpose, and your sense of purpose without coming across too cocky, pompous, or arrogant, okay? And the reason why I say that is because I like to believe I'm an optimist that the dire straits that we have in science won't last forever, because the simple fact is every darn thing we do in our civilization requires science. But the reality is there's not a lot of positions. So, and there's not a lot of funding to get the positions sometimes. So you really want to come across as strong, but not overbearing as possible, if that makes sense. Because that's really key. They want to know, if I invest the time, energy, and resources into this person, are they going to go on, let's say a postdoc, are they really motivated, are they really hungry, do they want to go to be a faculty member, do they want to go into industry? And that's another thing, knowing your audience, which I haven't said yet, I don't really, it's not really up there, written there, is really important. Because it's okay if you want to do a postdoc and then go into industry. And in fact, there's a lot of PIs like myself that kind of dig that, because we know what your goal is. And we have colleagues or contacts in the private sector that we can gear you toward that, but we need to kind of get an idea of where you want to go. Because if we don't, it's hard to help you. It's really hard to get you going in that right direction. It becomes even more critical when you're an assistant professor, right? Because now, there's a department, there's an institution that's about to spend money on you, anywhere between $500,000 to maybe $600,000, $700,000 to bring you in, which includes your salary, as well as startup packages and other benefits. So that's a significant financial commitment to you. And most institutions, regardless of all the dire things that you've heard, they don't want to get rid of their faculty, because if they do, they've wasted that infrastructure money that they just expended on you, right? It makes sense. Now, it's a different story if someone just sits there and will not budge and will not be productive and will not take assistance. That's a different ball of wax, and they got to cut their losses and move forward. But I truly believe and have seen in more circumstances than not where administrative personnel, chairpersons, don't really want to see faculty fail, because it's in their best interest for them to succeed, for goodness sakes. And the same thing is true for postdocs. So, what goes into a research statement? What exactly is a research statement? This is where we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritties of the details of the research statement. So, in a research statement, you articulate your research field. So we already kind of talked about critical directions. We talked about promising lines of inquiry, maybe even a little bit of a synopsis of the field, right? Which kind of provides a frame of reference. And I'm going to beat my slides where I'm going to tell you, if you have a research statement that's longer than 3 pages, you're killing yourself. Killing yourself. No one wants to read an intense amount of writing and minutiae detail because they've got 20 different applicants that they're looking at, okay? And that's not to say dumb it down, okay? There's a happy medium that you have to hit. And this is the reason why I tell you to write, practice, practice, practice. Because you don't want to be too simple, because then people think you're not sophisticated, intelligent, etc. But you don't want to be too complicated, because the person that is reviewing your application may not be an expert in your area, may not appreciate it. Right? So it's a happy medium. You need to talk about your own research. Again, this is what the whole purpose of it is. So I'll get to this concept of immediate term, midterm, and long-term goals in more detail in a bit. But the reality is, knowing that you got through graduate school and you got through a postdoc typically tells people you're a type A individual and you're a glutton for punishment. And that's okay, because we all are. But at the same time, you have already demonstrated the leadership capability of being able to make goals and set them for yourself, right? And that's key. That's huge. And communicate that, because then that gives confidence to the people who are reviewing your application, okay? That this person's got it on the ball, they know where they're going to go, things of that nature. What about the content? Well, a clear statement of the problem, right? And this could be the research problem that you initially tackled, or the general aspect. Let's say, for example, in my laboratory, we're interested in really 3 areas. And if I were to have to write a research statement being funded in 3 different areas, would actually be really difficult because I couldn't write that in 3 pages. I'd have to pick one, and I know where I'm going at, and that's where I want to go, right? And I'd have to be very clear, and I'd have to set the stage. Imagine the person that you're communicating this to really doesn't know a whole lot about it, and you just grab them by the hand and walk them through the process, walk them through the story. Be initially broad and inclusive, and then drill down so that you can communicate to them your direction and your focus. The summary and the impact state of the art today is really kind of part of this. And the reason why I mentioned summary impact of state of art is that, going back to the example of the one student that had one paper, right? But they slogged away at it and developed a new method. If you developed a new method, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty important. Because now all of a sudden, that means you're at a leading edge of one aspect of a field. And those are the kind of people you really want to bring in because they got some momentum. You want to give them fuel for their flame, and they'll just shoot off into the stratosphere. Discuss the research methods and approach. Be careful with this, okay? This is a lot of stuff. You will have, more times than not, additional opportunities to communicate this information outside of your research statement through your research proposal. You see what I mean? And I only listed it here because when I went through Penn State's website and looked at some others and talked to people that I know that are in engineering departments, those folks are, I mean, we're analytical, but those folks are really analytical, man. Wow. They deal intensely, numbers, facts, figures, minutiae, as I call it sometimes. And this is what they are comfortable in, and this is what they do. So it depends on the kind of application that you're submitting and where you're submitting it to. How unique is your problem? The one thing that you certainly don't want to be is another Me Too, right? You want to stand out. You just don't want to be somebody else that's looking at AKT and a slight derivation in response to X, right? Because there's already 4,000 people in the world that are looking at AKT and the situation A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way throughout. So how do you stand out? How unique is your approach to a paradigm that's maybe common and critical, but how special is your way of going about that? That's really important. The where of your research statement. Where does it belong? I think most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. So regarding the previous slide, so all those the research methods and approaches, they're applicable for research statement that is made for assistant professor position rather than grad students applying for postdoc. So what would you suggest for a grad student applying for a postdoctoral position to make a good impression on the potential?
Sure. So what I would suggest in that case is kind of going back to this, which is the articulation of your research, what your motivation and history was, what your results were and your approaches to date. You're not going to have a lot of details for the mid and long-term goals, but you're going to have intermediate and short-term results that you can communicate to people. And they're not going to ask you necessarily, okay, now I want a research proposal from you. Some people may, because some labs say, look, when you come in this lab, I fully expect that you're going to write for an NRSA or a postdoctoral fellowship or something, because that's part of their training philosophy, right? And so they may ask for this, but on first pass, typically the detail that you see here would not be included. Mm-hmm. Again, keep in mind that you don't want to lose people. You got 2 to 3 pages to capture them and make them go, okay, I put this application in the key pile and I rescued this one, right? And I'll follow up with that one a little bit later on. Okay. So this is like anything else. I mean, I kind of call it scientific dating in many ways, not to sound, catchish about it, but the reality is you don't know this person from Adam, and you want to get to know them a little bit, right? And so you got to break the ice somehow, and this is kind of the way to do it.
One more. So, well, pretty much in the previous slide, when you say about the history of motivation in history,
Right.
some people like me have few postdocs in the past, and they may not be directly connected, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So, how important are those? How important are those that you had previously and you spent, I don't know, 2 years doing research in the field, and then you changed the field quite significantly? And you move on to the, I don't know, assistant professor position.
No. And that's a good question, especially in this climate. It's a really pressing dilemma that a lot of people have. What I would tell you, and it's a couple slides later on are going to say it, address all these things head on. Don't sugarcoat them, don't dance around them, because they're going to come up. And if they don't, then that review committee is not doing their due diligence in evaluating the applications. And the reality is, we all have circumstances that affect our course, our path, right? We may have personal circumstances that affect it, we may have professional, we may just have, you know, stuff happens, experiences, right? That you just can't control. And those things are okay. And there may be some things that, you know, let's say for example, a grant ended and money was tight and that was it. And that's the reality of the world. And that's okay to say. It's no poor reflection on you or poor reflection on the mentor, especially if you, as the trainee, was publishing and was getting recognized at meetings or giving talks or things like that. I mean, that clearly communicates that this person's been productive, but with pay lines at the 8th and 6th percentile, I mean, you're almost as good going to the riverboat as you are going to NIH at this point. But that's not to say that it's impossible. It's not, but it's the reality of the situation. So don't address them. Do address them. You know, something else most people don't think about sometimes is where you got your research experience. And why do I say this? Well, again, remember I said earlier on that sometimes people are looking for a particular kind of candidate. I mean, all the people that I brought into my lab, I was looking for a particular kind of candidate. And everyone that's in my lab has their own area of expertise, and they all work collaboratively and interconnectedly, and we all benefit. So they have an idea, and then if you tell them, look, I learned EPR spectroscopy work at this fantastic place at the National Institute of Environmental Health in Research Triangle Park, which has the best EPR facility, and Bruckner is there and does all the testing for their new machines, that's a really important piece of information to put in there, because then that person's going to go, I want to interview that person. You know, all of a sudden you're at the top of the list, right? Or if you've done, say, clinical translational work and you've worked with patients a lot and they need to do some patient studies, well, you communicate that to them, okay, we want this person to come through first. Environments, as everyone in here knows, environments are unique. No campus, no institution is the same. They don't have the same skill sets. They don't have the same investigators. And oftentimes, those situations are unique and you can use them to your advantage. When? So when do you submit it? Initially, that's pretty easy. And then when is it important? It's important at the very beginning. Because again, this goes basically over the same thing I said already. They're going to use this to help separate out people that they want to interview and people that they don't want to interview. Or at least, or maybe second round interviews, I should say. And you want to get in the initial round. You want to make the first cut. Why? Well, we discussed that already. And then the other thing that, and I put this in here because sometimes people don't really, don't get some of the other aspects of motivating factors. And in that slide that had the laundry list of things that go in it, it was motivating factors. Sometimes if, you know, you have a motivation other than you really are fascinated by the area, let's say a friend of yours died due to leukemia, or your sister has type 1 diabetes, or you have a disease, that's really useful information to know. Because again, it helps introduce you to the evaluators, and it also helps provide insight as to what drives you as a person. Because we all know science is not easy, and you want to make sure you get the right people in doing the right job, and that when things get tough, they don't fold. Why do the reviewers care? because of course they want to get the ideal candidate in mind. And the important thing is, do not try to be all things to everyone, okay? Pick your battles. There's a lot of things that are out there. There's a lot of opportunities. Sometimes people may try to get a position that doesn't quite fit, and if it feels forced, people that are reviewing the applications will feel it too. And they may not, they may say, wow, this is a smart person, they're really good, but I just don't see the fit, right? I just don't see how it works. So don't try to make it too difficult or fit a round peg in a square hole. How do you write one? Well, you integrate the what contents of the research statement from above, and you lay it out clearly and carefully. Clearly is the key, okay? And how do you make it effective? These are some of the really important points here. These are the nuggets, if you will, that I would recommend. The next two slides are probably the most important slides I would look at. Use headings and subheadings to organize your document. Everyone hates to read just a 10-point Times Roman or Arial font that's very small and it's just dense. And you're thinking, oh crap, I gotta read through this whole thing. And it's tough. Because especially when you've got, let's say, 10 or 15 applicants, it's hard to get through that. Write it in a logical order. It should flow smoothly, right? Don't talk about, where you want to go and then talk about your past and then talk about your intermediate accomplishments. That's going to be hard for the reader to follow. Don't do that. I mean, you can start from the present, working back. You can start from the back, working forward. Just make sure it flows in a logical direction. That's really key. Again, kind of coming up to what Mike said earlier, address any past problems or snafus head on. If you had a conflict with your mentor, okay, people are people. Admit it, fess up, right? Because the reality is, he or she is probably going to talk, or they're probably going to know some things that go on in the field. And the reality is, too, that it takes two to tango. One person is never wrong, the only one wrong in a disagreement, I should say. If there's a disagreement, it has to be between two people. So both parties have responsibility for that disagreement. And more times than not, the person that's reviewing it isn't the one that's upset with you. So don't make them your enemy by casting doubt into their mind. Avoid page-long paragraphs, okay? So I don't know if you guys have seen this, but somebody will start an indentation at the beginning of the page, and then we'll write a whole page all the way down. This is not good. Do not do that. Again, it's great that I have a kid that's in middle school because I can go back and refresh not only myself, but everyone else. How do you construct a paragraph? You have a thesis sentence. You have 3 or 4 maybe max points that you're communicating about that thesis sentence and a summary sentence. Multiple paragraphs. Now, one paragraph can deal with one particular topic, and the next paragraph will deal with another topic. Don't shove them all together because it's just not gonna. It's gonna be horrible to read. Again, I already said this, so it's not a big deal. If you don't write well, get help. Right? It's kind of like anybody who has a problem. Just admit it and move on. No one is perfect, and it's really key because the sooner you get help, the better it will be for you. And the reality is, if I lived in another country, I darn sure couldn't write in their language. I'm here to tell you. I'm doing good just to write it in English, much less French, German, Chinese, Japanese. I couldn't do it. So I would certainly be going there to get help. There's no doubt about it. Get feedback from as many people as you possibly can. You would think that, I'll just get it from my mentor or my advisor. Get it from a lot of different people. Get it from your peers. Sometimes they'll be able to say, wow, you told me about that really cool study or experiment that you did in your paper that was really instrumental, but you don't even mention that here. You know what I mean? Because sometimes your friends and colleagues know more about you than you think they do, which is really important. And again, proofread it many times. I cannot overemphasize the importance of that. You don't get a second chance for a first impression. You just don't. Content, clear and concise writing. We've already kind of talked about that. Sound fresh, right? don't sound like, oh crap, I gotta write this research statement, I'm kind of tired of this, I don't want to do it. I mean, when you write like that, it's gonna sound like that to the reader. Where appropriate, acknowledge work of others, because that's something that's really important. That gives the reader a perspective of how well you know your field. Because we all like to think we're the best, right? We all like to think we're great, but we're all in this boat together. And we're all dealing with work that somebody else did, and we're advancing it one step forward beyond that. Sometimes we make a little bit bigger jumps than others, but it's still more or less the same. So that helps provide insight to the reader. Use language that shows you've begun to think of yourself as an independent researcher. Again, this gets back to the confidence thing. Remember that bullet point I had? The confidence, that's key. If you are successful, what are the possible big picture results, right? So in other words, here's my research statement, and this is probably more applicable for applying to an assistant professor position, right? And you say, if my grant study or my grant proposal is successful, here's why it will be meaningful to the field. Because then they're gonna go, wow, okay, this person's thought about that. They've thought it through, they have an area they want to target and they want to make an impact in, and then they really possibly could, which is a good thing because you want those people around. If you've identified, this is also very important, especially if you're applying for assistant professor position or even associate full professor, that is an obligatory requirement. Funding organizations, if you've identified sources of funding, this is really good because it also communicates to the readers that you've thought about this, that you know you don't operate in a vacuum and you're not going to be a mooch and you're not going to bleed off of them. And these days, that's a good thing because it says this person's hungry, they're moving forward, and they want to advance their career.
Question?
Yeah.
Maybe it's kind of commit. So speaking of funding organization, if you're applying for a postdoc position during grad students, do you think it's worth to put the thoughts about applying for American Heart and RSA grants as you move on as a postdoc? Because sometimes the position that is advertised, the boss, does not imply such moves. So I mean, you can hardly distinguish that from the text of the advertisement.
Right. So
do you think it's worth doing, or
if that's your desire, most certainly, most certainly. It's interesting, and I'll make an observation because I was trained by previous generation, which is people that are like Callahan, Granger, those folks, Dr. Awe, things of that nature, where the way of doing science was really narrowly defined, right? The concept of doing business, the concept of working in pharmaceutical industry really was there, but it wasn't expanded like it is now. The concept of biotech sector, when I went to UAB and saw how that grad school had a whole bloody division on biotech, and they would bring people in from Pfizer, they'd bring people in from Merck, and they would take those students and they would say, look, this is what you want to do. We're going to groom you to do this because we know what we want. We don't want a bunch of professors running around because that's not going to help our company, right? And so in that transition, when I was a fellow, I saw, at least what I believe to be a shift in the way the execution of biomedical research occurs. And so nowadays, you have everything from people who do the classic route, if you will, to the biotech, corporate business side of things, to even people who do stuff like public policy. Through the ASCB, which I was a member of for many years, I went to Capitol Hill 4 years in a row during the Clinton era where they were doubling the budget to shake the hands of all the legislatures that kept voting for that. And it was really cool because I saw a lot of people that were really interested in science and public policy, and they've gone on to make a separate career. Now that hasn't grown up per se or expanded as much as the others have, but there's even more than that. There's even now another arm, which is education and science. So the point here is, it's hard to predict what A, a fellow wants, B, a mentor or a group will want. You do what you think is best. Because I know some people at different institutions, if they don't hear that in an application, they won't review it. I don't hear it in an application, I'm not gonna throw it in the can. I know what I'm interviewing that person for, and if they're gonna fulfill that need, then I talk to them some more. Maybe they don't wanna be in academics. That's cool, I get that. You know, but I gotta find out what it is they wanna do so I can help them get there. Because again, it's a two-way street. Maybe I'm too touchy-feely as a mentor. I should probably be more of an asshole, I guess. Summary tips. Get many good examples, right? There are lots of them that are out there. There are lots of them that are on the web. And I'm sure many of your mentors probably have them. I would get them. Consult lots of people. Your advisor and faculty are the key. You know, don't ever underestimate the importance of this, because regardless of whether you have an advisor who's touchy-feely or you have an advisor who's bristly, your success is going to reflect on them. Don't ever forget that. That's huge. They don't really want to see you fail. They may be harsh, or they may push you, they may drive you, but that's okay, because at the end of the day, the goal there is to make you the best that you can be. This career development information on the web or your professional organization is really key. One of the things that I've seen through different societies that I'm involved in, like Society of Free Radical Biology and Medicine, American Heart, American Diabetes, is they all have groups where early career scientists or young scientists can go do mixers, go to career development seminars, workshops. That's really awesome. It's really cool. Because not only does it give you information that you need to know, but more importantly, it allows you to make contacts. Because getting people's input from different institutions is often good. Again, get professional assistance if you need it, and don't forget that. I'm done. Unless you have questions. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ron.
So we don't have, like, you know, career development office or anything like that here. Is there even like some type of writing studio type function here? Because like when I was in grad school, though my tiny little institution didn't have one, we had access to the one that was at Vanderbilt, and it was ridiculous because like your grants didn't go anywhere until they ripped it apart.
Right.
You know, so a lot of times you go through that and your success rate was like
much better.
Yeah. So, and that, you know, talking about seeking professional help or just the idea of practicing, you know, I write okay, but it's hard.
It is. It's not easy.
It's really hard.
It's hard.
So, like having ways of just kind of getting things screened consistently by multiple people that are much better at it than I am, you know, like the English majors of the world.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
like, is there anything that
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the answer to that is no. Has it actually been discussed? Yes.
I think that's in the library. There is a service you can bring your papers and they will go through, but it's going to be English.
It's on the website.
But, so let me, okay, there is that. And I'm not, don't misunderstand what I'm about to say about the library. but they are helpful, but the reality is they don't know all the details about grants. And they don't know all the details about the science. And so what they'll do is they'll correct your grammar, your spelling, your syntax. And that's helpful, clearly. I'm not saying it's not. But at the same time, there are other things that I thought I heard you ask that were beyond that.
Yeah.
And that's something that at this institution, through Wendy Pruitt and the Office of Sponsored Programs, we've been discussing a lot, especially with Dr. Ward. Because I think that not only is needed for you guys and gals, but it's also needed for us. It'll help everybody, really. So, yes.
I'm just wondering, because you have said it's very important to practice writing all the time. And can you comment on if there are any different skills on, say, writing a proposal and writing a paper? Because
Yes.
both of them are important.
Right.
So-
No, and it's a very good point. And actually, they're completely different things. Completely different things.
Yeah, do you have any
Advice for that?
approach for
Yeah.
different two skills?
So I can just kind of tell you what I do. This is going to sound horrible. I like writing grants. I've learned over the years that writing grants for me is fun. Writing a paper bores me to death.
Can you tell me the
Reason why? Because when I get to a grant, what I do is I get all the information that I know in the field, know in the literature, and I can see it, and I can see the pros and cons. I make a evaluation list. I make my own process of figuring out how to determine what's fact from fiction, right? Some people could call it something else, but you know, that's kind of the way it is. And then say, okay, what are the big holes? Where are the things that we're pushing? Because I already know what we're doing, right? And I already know what the field is. Where is it that we can make a difference? Where is it that we can make a contribution? And see that, and then that's cool, because now I've identified the problem, okay? And I can craft my hypothesis around it. And I always start by crafting a hypothesis. And then it's a matter of building the best mousetrap. Because that's the cool thing about grants, is that's what you're doing, right? You're building a mousetrap. With a paper, you're just reporting the results. And then you go, okay, this is important because Joe said this wasn't real, and John said it was, and this may solve the disease. And some papers are better than that, but it's kind of, it's a little bit more dry. When I'm writing a grant, I have a chance to be very creative, much more creative than I do when I'm writing a paper. Because a paper, I just have to kind of tell you why you should care. I feel almost, I shouldn't say that, kind of like a car salesman in both situations. But with a grant, at least I have control over the car I'm selling. With the paper, if it's a jalopy, it's a jalopy, and I just got to find some willing soul to take it.
And so your point is that you're trying to pick up the problem within the paper that people have written instead of trying to find the problem, from your everyday experiment or,
I'll say this. Let me kind of shift a little bit. When I review a paper versus reviewing grants, which I think is what I heard you ask. When I review a paper, I review a paper for some basic concrete things. A, what was the problem they were studying? B, was it overtly descriptive versus mechanistic? And more importantly, was that appropriate? Did they communicate to me that if they did a fully descriptive paper, was it an obligatory requirement? Was it necessary? Was the work that they did necessary and how they did it? And then was that work well controlled, things of that nature? When I read a grant and I evaluate a grant, those things come into play for a grant, because when you read the experimental design, the research plan, you got to make sure that they've got controls in there, and you got to make sure they did power analysis and all these other things if they're doing, something besides cell work. But at the same time, I'm also looking for their creativity. I'm looking for their ingenuity. I'm looking for their capability to come up and tackle a problem, rather than just telling me how they did this work and where it fits in the broader scheme of things.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I have a question about the style, because usually when you write a paper, it must be very formal and dry. But what about grant or proposal? It also should be the same style, or could be more colloquial or more, optimistic about it. Because obviously in the paper you should be very concise and do not provide any information you are not sure for 100%. But if you make a proposal, it's something about the future. So what you think can be done in that field. Yeah.
So I would say you hit it right on the head. I agree with you. I think that in a paper, people always run the risk of over-interpreting things, right? We had that editor from New England Journal of Medicine. I don't know how many of you guys went, but that was a great talk she gave. Because there were basic principles on how to write a high-impact paper where people say, we were the first to do this. It's like, oh, crap, don't say that, because then it sounds pompous, which is one of those problems, right? Or they say, this is going to cure this disease. Well, that's just too rosy. That's not reality. So you're right. With a paper, you don't want to oversell or even short sell the importance of your work. So you've got to find the right place and where your work and your results fit in the field. But with a grant, you're absolutely right. You can be a little bit more animated. You can be more forward-thinking. Because if you're not, why is somebody going to give you hundreds of thousands of dollars to do the research? That's the way I view it. I might not be the typical grant reviewer because I know a lot of people that kind of like it boring and dry, but when I'm reviewing 20 grants, you know, till 11 or 12 o'clock at night, if I read something boring and dry, I'm going to fall asleep. It's just, I want to see somebody, and I do say this for the reviews I do at NIH and things of that nature. When you see somebody who's excited and motivated about the work and it comes through on paper, those are the things that are easier to go to bat for in a study section. And then you go, this has to be funded when there's only 2 grants and maybe 3 grants in the whole damn study section out of 50 or 60 that even have a snowball's chance in hell of getting funded. And then you go, here's the reason why. Because this guy gave me A, B, C, D, E reasons why this is very important. And, you know, that kind of enthusiasm is a good thing, I would say. Yeah.
I have another question.
Sure.
So, when you write a research statement for assistant professor position, you can write a research statement for a place like here, for a bigger university where you do research and teaching, or you can write a research statement for a primarily teaching university, let's put it, I don't know, Centenary College.
Yeah, sure, Centenary.
Obviously they're going to be different.
Correct.
So, how, I understand that you have to be realistic, but let's say you don't know about the research resources at the university. I mean, you can imagine, but you don't know in details. How optimistic can you be?
So here's the thing. I will tell you this. Before you ever submit your application, at all of the disclaimers that you see in Science or Nature Jobs or wherever, there is always a person's name and an email contact. Sometimes it's a telephone number. Reach out to them.
Okay.
Tell them that you're interested. Tell them that you are really, you know, sincerely interested in it. You want to find out more about it. Nowadays, the concept of submitting a grant, you talk to the program officer. You find out what kind of grants is this group or this study section funding, or NHLBI funding, for example, or NIDDK funding, because they may have a bunch of grants on glomerulonephritis and diabetes, and they may not have, you know, believe it or not, NIH has portfolios of grants, right? Because believe it or not, there's federally funded and federally mandated areas that they say are important to go fund. And if they're full up with all these kinds of grants, I mean, you could have the best grant and the cure for the disease, but they just don't have any more room in the bin for you to be in there, right? And so knowing where your target is and knowing what you're going after is key. If there's one thing that I would say in science that has been notoriously lacking, is people reaching out and people communicating. No one's going to be upset if you call them or send them an email, because that's their job. They're the one that's chair of the search committee, for God's sakes. So reach out to them. Say, hey, I'm really interested in this position. I'm thinking of putting my application together. I got a couple questions for you. If you have a few minutes, like maybe 4 or 5 minutes over the phone, that I could just kind of see what you guys are thinking about. And all of a sudden, you get that information. And you'll find out then, do they have the resources to do a lot of research? And if they don't, then you can adjust accordingly, right? But it's just like everything else. You have to have a plan. You have to have a strategy. You know, very few people I know that are successful in this business go in cold. They just don't. You can't.
And as a follow-up, so when you apply for the position, you can see faculty profiles. How important to include in your research statement the potential collaboration with other faculty members?
Huge. Could be very important. Could be very important. You know, you don't want to come across as sounding desperate or like, oh, you know, I'm going to be the best thing that ever happened to your department, which is the opposite end of that, right? But, you know, you could have a sentence or two in there that says, seeing the expertise in your department and hypertension work due to salt, you know, mediated hypertension in this area that I've looked at for many years could really lead to new collaborations or new research directions.
Mentioning names? That means that you look through that you're not applying blindly.
Yeah, I don't know if I would, because sometimes if you don't know them, it's kind of a ploy. You know what I mean? You want to be genuine. You really do want to be genuine.
I see.
And more importantly, you want to stick to you, right? Because the research plan is also selling your research or communicating your research. So don't spend an inordinate amount of time or even too much space on telling them yeah, you know. I mean, if you have space afterwards and you've communicated all the things, then that's okay. Go for it.
Please?
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, is there certain types of jargon you should avoid, like
Yes.
cliche things you shouldn't say?
You shouldn't write the way I just talked to you. You shouldn't say snowball's chance in hell and things like that. Don't do that. But you should be more formal than informal, because again, it communicates professionalism, it communicates your sincere interest in it. But at the same time, the other jargon that you should not do is you should not use excessive technical jargon that some people may or may not understand. Because remember, especially if you're going from a postdoc to an assistant professor, sometimes the chairperson of that search committee may have absolutely no experience in the area that it's being hired for, right? And so you need to kind of hit the middle ground so that at least they'll be able to follow you instead of getting down to the alphabet soup of the signaling transduction pathway you're studying. You know what I mean? Where people may get quickly overwhelmed if they don't do that.
I have one question.
Sure.
I'm always confused with this. So, what's the difference between a research statement and a letter of interest? Because some parts are very similar.
Yes. So a letter of interest is simply that. It's a letter. And it should be no more, in my mind, than 2 pages at the most. Because if you have a letter of interest, that tells them really, A, you saw it, how you saw it, if there was somebody, for example, that referred you to the job post, because sometimes, as many of you in here will know, that people know about jobs that are coming open before they're flown in the advertisement sections. And that's good, because then they'll say, well, I found out from Dr. Smith that you guys had this opening, and he thought that I should apply, or encouraged me to apply because I had a lot of, complementary skill sets or whatever. And that gives them an idea of why you're applying. Why do you have your interest? The letter of interest is to really communicate just that, your interest, not so much your research, but a research statement. You can put a paragraph in there about what your research is, and then expound upon it later on in your research statement.
I just saw some advertisement that they are specifically asking for a letter of interest, not the research statement. So in this instance, you have to put some of the parts from research statement into the letter of interest?
Right. Well, I have never seen that too frequently, honestly. I'll be honest with you, because hold on here. Okay, here we go. So here, this is an example of one of like a letter of application, a CV, a statement of research plan, and then teaching interests. So there's at least 4 or 5 different things that were actually asked for there. And then you go to this one, that's your CV as the publications, your transcripts for an assistant professor position. Statement of teaching experience, and then your statement. And so most of them are like this.
Yeah, this is higher in the ladder. I was talking about the postdoc advertisement. It's more here.
Okay. So for a postdoc advertisement, that might be different, because not every mentor or faculty member asks for a research plan for a postdoc. And in fact, I'll be honest, I haven't asked for one on many occasions, because most of the time the postdocs that have referred to me have either been through a faculty member that I know, and I know their work, or they met me at a meeting and came up to me and we talked. So we already broke the ice. We started the scientific date before, and we weren't kind of cold calling each other there. So You know, some places may do it differently, but
For postdoc positions, when is email appropriate versus the snail mail? Is it okay to kind of shoot a letter of interest through email, or do you think you should send a hard copy?
I would, whenever you're doing anything for an application, I would always do both. Most people accept emails, and it is usually pretty routine for people in academics because that's the way we work. That's kind of the way we are. But always follow it up, you know, and even in passing say, you know, I'll also be sending you a hard copy of this through the mail, because A, it reinforces your interest. B, it's a hard copy that he or she has to hold on to. And C, that might be needed in the hiring process. You see what I mean? Yeah.
If it doesn't state in the application, if it's posted, please send information to this email, would you still send a hard copy, or it's okay to just do email? If that's
To
all
me,
it has?
I would always do both. To me, I would always do both. And I mean, it sounds redundant, but I don't know about you guys, but I got some of my first opportunities and positions by just hounding the crap out of people. Really. Because I mean, they're like, who's this snot-nosed kid? I don't know him, you know, great, he's like science, but I kept pounding him, I kept pounding him, I kept pounding him. And I didn't do it meanly, mind you. I just kind of sat there and said, hey, I like your stuff, I want to work. And then after I kept submitting the email or submitting the letter, they finally got the picture. And I don't mean it to say that they didn't care, because I'm probably the world's worst, as the people in my life will tell you. Getting so many emails all of the time, it gets overwhelming. And when I go to my regular box, I actually get letters. I like that now. Because I'm like, wow, somebody actually took the time to send me a letter. That's really impressive. So, and plus, then it helps remind me, oh crap, they actually wrote me an email 2 weeks ago, I need to respond. Or I need to move their application forward, you know, something like that.
So what is teaching philosophy? Can you give an example?
Sure.
My comment on that, I'm planning to do the separate thing on that. So you can hound Chris for that, but I want to do the separate thing.
Sure. So in general, the teaching philosophy, just to paraphrase it, so that whoever does the teaching philosophy in the next session, I don't steal their thunder. It is how you approach teaching to students, and you know this is something that's easier for an assistant professor and higher to write. It's typically harder for postdocs to write, and sometimes maybe not possible for grad students to write, especially here, because most of our grad students don't TA like they do at like a Baton Rouge campus, for example, where they'd be doing TAs in a chemistry lab if they came from a chemistry department, and then they'd have a bigger history. But that being said, let's say, for example, if you're in a lab where it has graduate students and some other fellows, and you were instrumental in instructing them, teaching them how to do these things, you could say how you did that. Or if somebody said, look, hey, I want you to go teach some courses at Allied Health School for, you know, either pathology or physiology, which ours have done and different departments do, that's cool too. And then you can say, look, I've done that, and here's how I go about doing it. And if you go through the concept of how to teach, which not a lot of us do here, there's different methods, and if you used a particular method, you could say, you know, what you did, things like that. I'll leave it at that.
No spoils. No spoils.
I'll leave it alone. Good luck, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.